Thank you, Cynthia, and I think you made it very clear that the pipeline infrastructure in this country is indeed critical infrastructure, and we certainly appreciate the focus you have on protection of that under all these conditions. Our next speaker is from the U.S. Coast Guard. Rear Admiral Peter Brown is the Assistant Commandant for Response Policy, and he is going to talk about, I'm sure, the response side of hurricanes. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Watson, and to BSEE and all the partners here for putting this forum together. It's a great pleasure to join in this. And although I am the Director of Response Policy, I'd rather not respond. I'd rather us talk a little bit more about planning, preparedness, and it was mentioned by Dr. Sullivan earlier that, that planning is vital, but it's not the plan itself that's so important. It's the communication and collaboration that goes into the planning process that helps us to work together when we do have to respond to a critical incident. I also want to point out that the Coast Guard and BSEE have been working together for the past several years in a variety of working groups to improve that level of readiness and to coordinate our responses even better than we have in the past. We will work together to make every effort not only to prepare ourselves but also others for hurricane contingency operations, focusing on the safety of life, safety of property, the environment, and also the restoration of the marine transportation system and industry to full operation for the benefit of the American people. So we want to continue this dialogue and openly communicate with industry and others. And I'd also like to point out that in addition to folks here in Washington, the industry and our partners have a great regional partner in Rear Admiral Kevin Cook, our 8th District Commander, headquartered in New Orleans. He's got great experience and prevention and preparedness mindset and a willingness to work with industry and interagency, federal, state, and local partners to make sure that we're prepared for the impact of severe weather and then restore our waterways and facilities just as quickly as possible afterwards. Specifically, we work with BSEE, with industry, and with hurricane forecasters to coordinate the timing of shut-ins and facility evacuations to both maintain production as long as it's safe to do so, and then to get people out of harm's way as quickly as we can, and then be ready to restore as quickly as we can. We also help to ensure the accountability of personnel to make sure that no one is left behind. We do that in a variety of ways, including doing pre-storm overflights and what we call call-outs to make sure that people who are mariners who are in the path of an approaching hurricane are aware of and ready to respond. We also then move Coast Guard assets, both floating assets and aviation assets, out of the storm's path, but staying as close by as is safely possible to ensure that we're ready to respond as quickly as possible after storm passage, both from a search and rescue standpoint and to begin that assessment and restoration process of the industry. We work with BSEE and industry on monitoring the safe movement of mobile platforms to places of refuge, and we talked extensively about the GPS monitoring, and we participate in that to help make sure that situations like we saw with the ENSCO 74 aren't repeated in the future. We try to make sure that our personnel are as ready as possible to respond. In doing that, we recognize that in several recent incidents, Katrina and Sandy in particular, that Coast Guard responders were also personally impacted by the storm. And with that in mind, the Coast Guard is standing up an incident management team that will be prepared to deploy to a storm location or a response location so that if our response personnel who would normally respond are impacted, we have another team of highly trained interagency operative professionals to go in and assist in that initial response. Now moving to that post-storm recovery, I mentioned the marine transportation system, absolutely vital, not only to the flow of commerce, but to the flow of the people who will restore the offshore facilities, whether those are pipelines or facilities, rigs and platforms to their normal operating capacity. And so our focus is on getting the ports reopened, and we learned a vital lesson in Hurricane Sandy, and that is we often, from a safety standpoint, would consider a port closed with some exceptions. We now realize we have to move much more quickly to a status of open with some restrictions. so that the default position is that vessels of a certain draft or within certain industries are able to operate just as quickly as is safely possible. A couple other points that I'd like to make. We really appreciate the partnership that we have with our other agency partners, not only including BSEE, but others, really building what we'd like to call a lasting federal partnership to improve safety and environmental protection in that offshore environment. We realize that BSEE and the Coast Guard have a variety of authorities and capabilities, and we want to work together to make sure that those are cooperative, coordinated, consistent, and non-redundant, so that industry can get back into business just as quickly as safely possible while still protecting the environment. So in closing, I want to thank the industry and our other government agencies for their effort over the past years in preparing for this, particularly in putting together this forum. We and your offshore we want to keep pace with the fleet of fixed and floating offshore platforms, the improvements in technology that can narrow the range of danger as forecasting improves, and we want to work to keep those waterways, the operators, and a marine environment safe. So again, I want to thank you, Director Watson, for this opportunity. I look forward to the question and answer period.
Thanks, Pete. And I'm sure you know, the people who live and work offshore are particularly indebted to the services of the U.S. Coast Guard. And I think that it's important to note that this is a multi-mission organization that also is focused on the restoration of the energy supply and of course, the marine transportation system post-hurricane as well. So thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is from the Environmental Protection Agency. Ms. Dana Toulis is from the Office of Emergency Management, and I've worked a long time with Dana. I'm really glad she's here to give us some remarks from an environmental protection perspective.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to try to be brief. I know you have a number of folks that you've been hearing from this morning. Jim, it's always great to see you in whatever venue we work together. We work very closely during the Deepwater Horizon response, and I think we're still recovering from that. EPA has many roles. Most of you know us our role as protecting the environment, which is really what we do on a day-to-day basis, both as well as preparedness and response. We serve as the chair of the National Response Team, along with U.S. Coast Guard, which is the vice chair, working closely with 15 member agencies, basically preparing on a day-to-day basis for the day-to-day and responding together as well. We conduct exercises frequently, working together in tandem to ensure when a true response happens that we're all ready and prepared. We are constantly looking at lessons learned from the prior responses and working to apply those to improve the way we respond to our future responses. EPA is the inland lead, and the Coast Guard, as you would expect, is the coastal lead for responses. But that line isn't a very, very hard line. It can be a dotted line because it really depends on what makes the most sense as we respond together to make sure we do the best for protecting the environment and working together in our partnership. EPA often conducts analyses, a lot of analyses, when we're responding to some sort of response. For the Katrina response, we actually conducted 450,000 environmental analyses for the soil, the sediment, the air. We're constantly out there ensuring the public about their safety and making sure that if there are responses, if there are releases, we are responding, but also monitoring the environment both before and after those responses. We remove hazardous containers, we respond to releases, we remove white goods, we issue permits, we issue fuel waivers, as do the other agencies when you have these responses and you need to get into the area and you need to make sure fuel is there. We actually have monitoring that we can do with an airplane. It's known as aspect, because when the infrastructure after a hurricane or tornado, whatever the issue is, the natural disaster is, you can't always get in on the roads, and so we're able to fly overhead and to be able to monitor the environment that way as well. Although we are the lead for what we know as the ESF, it's emergency support function for FEMA, it's called 10, oil and hazardous substances, we do whatever is needed. For example, during the Katrina response, We had a number of boats because we were doing sampling because of the flooding, and there was about 800 people whose lives needed to be saved, and our boats were there. And even though that's not our core function, we got out there and we rescued those folks from their houses that were flooded. And I think that's how we all work. We all have our missions, but we also work together and realize we have to complement and work together, whether it's with our federal partners, our states, our locals. We're all there together trying to figure out the best way to respond, as well as to prepare. The Gulf of Mexico response, the Deepwater Horizon response, we're still working on recovering from that. We're still working on implementing lessons learned from that. EPA plays a very large role in the use of dispersants, and we've working on lessons learned on that. We just work very closely with our NRT members, the U.S. Coast Guard, NOAA, DOI, on guidance that we work with in the interagency, on improving monitoring, on looking at toxicity, on looking at effectiveness of dispersants and making sure we're using as little as we can, but there are just times when you have to use it to be able to respond and take care of the environment. And so we work together on that process as well. As you've heard from just about everybody here, it's all about preparedness. We don't like to respond, but we have to respond, and we try to use those opportunities to always learn for the next response. We work very closely as partners, and we work very closely to leverage each other's resources. Within our own agency, although I have a group of a few hundred people that we work with on a day-to-day basis, if there's a response, we have 3,000 people or volunteers within our agency that we can reach out to. We call it our Response Support Corps. We are constantly moving our Emergency Operations Center forward. We are constantly looking at new IT systems and figuring out ways to integrate our data with the other federal agencies, so as we're sampling, we can all be learning and working together to figure out what are the appropriate next steps. For an example with Superstorm Sandy of a lessons learned, protection and resiliency for our water plants and our waste treatment plants. We're working right now on some additional funding we received with the states and locals to improve the resiliency. As we know, the storms are getting bigger, and so areas like New York City are more threatened than they have been in the past. And so we have to be creative the way that we've developed a lot of our infrastructure and look to make it, to constantly improve it. We also work on public safety advisories when there's some sort of storm or release coming, whether it's a hurricane, tornado, whatever it is, to let folks know if you see flooding, to keep away if you've got flooded areas, whatever it is. We provide guidances and cautions for the public as well. We play a very big role in releasing data and monitoring and working with the public on a regular and routine basis. It's part of our heart and soul of who we are as an agency, is to share and be transparent about all the data we're collecting, but to make sure it's undergone good quality control and good scientific rigor before we release it, to make sure we have an accurate understanding of the environment and where we're going forward. What's it we do? We work with you all, we work with the states, the locals, and the other federal agencies, not just to ensure we have the best preparedness, but to also ensure that we can all respond together the best way we can.
Thank you, Dana, and no one could agree with you more about not wanting to respond, but being ready to in case we have to. And I think your agency is outstanding in their focus on public health and safety, and environmental safety, of course. Our next speaker is from the Federal Emergency Management Administration. Rear Admiral Joe Nimick is the Associate Administrator for the Office of Response and Recovery. Joe.
Thank you, Jim. I'd like to thank BSEE and the other panel members for including me here. And I say including me here because FEMA has no statutory authority nor responsibility for offshore events. FEMA is, in fact, a coordinating body under the National Response Framework to support the states when there is an emergency. And those emergencies range from smaller issues through things like you've seen in Oklahoma to Sandy, Katrina, and those large events. As I said, we do that through the National Response Framework, which sets up a structure by which all of the federal response to an emergency come together. But it's important that I'm here, even though we don't have statutory authority or responsibility, because the impacts of what is done on the offshore infrastructure will impact the disaster ashore, and there are things that FEMA does and can do without that statutory authority through the National Response Framework as an assisting coordinating body to BSEE and the other agencies that are here. So I'd like to give you just a short summary of what FEMA is and how we do that coordinating function. Through the National Response Framework, you've heard it mentioned several times here, the interagency comes together. All of the federal capabilities are coordinated in order to provide to that disaster, the states who are ultimately responsible to the citizens in that state for how a disaster is responded to, how the federal entities come together to support that. And you've heard the term ESF used several times. Several of the members of the panel here are leads on ESF. That's an emergency support function. And there are 15 emergency support functions that bring federal capability together and coordinate how that federal capability will respond. So when we look at a crisis like Hurricane Sandy and the challenge of unwatering major infrastructure like tunnels in Manhattan, we turn to not FEMA, but FEMA coordinates the Army Corps of Engineers, who's responsible for that particular ESF 3, and they look at other entities around the nation that have capability. They'll look inside the Department of Defense and bring together the Seabees, the naval construction battalions that may have capability, and quite frankly, the Coast Guard strike team, and bring all of that capability looking at the problem set from multiple eyes to give the best solution. We do that in communications, we do that in mass care, we do that in many functions. So why is what we're talking about today important for me? Well, energy is a key factor in any disaster, in being able to address the survivors and the survivability of those survivors and the establishment and reestablishment of the community that was damaged. So we do look at how electricity, how the oil and gas infrastructure impacts the electrical structure, how it impacts the gasoline that's needed. All of those factors go into our planning, and as was indicated, there's an entire ESF that looks at energy and coordinates our response to a disaster in energy. But I also look at it as that coordinating capability we have can be applied outside the normal FEMA structures. Last year, as a result of the droughts in the Midwest, the Interior came to FEMA and said, can we use the same coordinating, the same national response framework in addressing how all of the federal entities that have a role and potential role in supporting the drought-restricted areas can be supported? And FEMA, in fact, provided that same coordinating capability. And we can do something similar to that for the offshore industry if, in fact, that is a necessary response to a disaster. But as you've heard here before, and my pitch is, preparedness reduces the impact of a disaster. It's not just the plans, it's the execution of the plans, it's the exercising of the plans, and quite frankly, it's the rewriting of the plans. It's the process of planning that builds relationships, builds understanding. It is not the implementation of the plan after it's been written by people who never participated in the process. So I look at what API does, what BSEE does, what others do in terms of creating the process and the activities we're doing today that actually build that structure. And the last is I have to put a pitch in for NOAA. We are so fortunate today with the information we get and the warnings we get in terms of their accuracy and timeliness. Lives were saved in Oklahoma because the additional 8 minutes that exist today of warnings for tornadoes that didn't exist 2 years ago saved lives in Oklahoma. They saved lives in hurricanes. They save lives in virtually every event that we have. And the last pitch is, we're talking about notice events, preparing for the hurricane that you get that notice. Please don't lose sight of the no-notice events. And while earthquakes in the Gulf of Mexico are unlikely, there's oil infrastructure offshore of Southern California and other areas where that no-notice event is going to create a completely different dynamic, and we need to be aware of those no-notice events. So I thank you very much, Jim, for putting this on, for inviting us in FEMA, even though we don't have any authority. or responsibility, but we are there to support you, DOE, all of the entities that deal in that infrastructure, because it is critical to the nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and those of us that do focus on the outer continental shelf really appreciate the interest and the coordination that we have with the FEMA and also with your state counterparts, the emergency managers in all the states and counties and parishes. We try to take a page from your book as we do planning and preparation for outer continental shelf impacts. Our next speaker, and he will be the final speaker from a federal agency for us today, is Mr. James Devine. He's from the United States Geological Survey, and he is the Senior Advisor for Science Applications from USGS. Mr. Devine.
Thank you very much, Admiral. The first question people might ask is, what would be the interests of the U.S. Geological Survey relative to hurricanes? Hopefully my remarks this morning will help answer that question. Secondly, as the 10th speaker here this morning, what I'm about to say will sound like a broken record, and that is virtually everything we do relative to this arena is done in cooperation with the bureaus and agencies here on the dais, starting with NOAA, FEMA, Coast Guard, EPA, DOE, and other agencies not mentioned here today. So it truly is a cooperative effort on what we do. And after having been the USGS emergency coordinator for over 20 years, I've seen that coordination develop from just little spikes or none to a full-blown process that you've been hearing about here all morning. So quickly, what does USGS do? First, thanks to the capability of NOAA in giving us advance warning of where, when, and how big the event's going to be, we are in a position to pre-position our assets to be ready to, at the right spot with the right equipment to do what our jobs is set out to do. Secondly, because of those warnings, we are giving some time to assess conditions prior to the event. One of the, a FEMA director one time told me, what I need to know is what did it look like before and what does it look like now? And if you can answer those two questions, you're a step ahead on what you need to do. So our goal is to assess what the conditions look like, and that is the shoreline, the barrier islands, the status of the streams and conditions of the streams near the shoreline. These are elements that fall within our domain. After the event goes by, and a hurricane in this case, our first role is to, of course, assess what our own capabilities and impacts have been and our ability to function and provide corrections that we need in order to put the right team in the field. And secondly, what is that team and what do we do? We have a strong capability and a strong requirement to assess the condition of the shoreline, particularly where the pipelines come ashore, the geologic processes that's underway, the status of the barrier islands. As you know, they're all in deep jeopardy from sea level rise and other conditions like hurricanes, and to assess the quality, quantity, and capability of the streams nearby. Thirdly, we have a major role in providing geospatial information for the rest of the community to use. You need to know where you are and what's moved and where things end up, particularly in areas where you've lost signs, you've lost the familiar landmarks that one uses. When they disappear, you're left without your normal capability of determining where you are. So starting with the data we provide, we operate the Landsat satellite, which provides mid-resolution data. We provide that data immediately, and in our past hurricanes such as Katrina and Ike, we sent out 20, 30 terabytes of geospatial data to provide for the entire community to assist their knowing where they are and where they need to go. Secondly, we are prepared and frequently fly LiDAR data immediately after the event to determine more precisely what has changed and how much and where. We have the ability to invoke the international charter, which brings all the world's satellite operating companies who have agreed to provide data free in the midst of a natural emergency. So this provides a very rich set of imagery and other geospatial data, which is critical for the response mechanism. We also have access to other sources of imagery and remote sense data, which can be applied to the problem. And finally, in the event that there is an oil spill associated with the hurricane, we can provide a suite of geological, geophysical, remote sensing, and other analytical tools to help assess the amount, the location, the quality, and the potential of the spill. So combine those elements, we fit in, we think, very neatly with a suite of efforts made by the agencies that you see in front of you here. So with that, I'll take any questions that one might have. Thank you, Kevin.